It's Q&A time, and what we're going to do to allow me to remain standing is we're going to ask Father Evanson to stay right where he is, and I'm going to pass the mic to him to answer the questions, but I'm going to use the mic to repeat the questions as they come from the floor. Now, since I have the mic, that means I get to ask the first question. I am especially interested in the relationship between Zion and Redeemer Fort Wayne. We heard that Father Evanson was a friend of Father Runge, and Father Evans well, and was involved with liturgical renewal with them. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Father Evanson and ask him if he would comment for just a moment or two on the relationship between Zion Detroit and Redeemer Fort Wayne.
Well, mostly, to my mind, it's been a personal relationship. As I mentioned earlier, my first visit to this parish was Holy Week 1957. And then I got to know Father Kenneth, and 10 years later, I became pastor at St. John's on Oakman Boulevard. And it was during my time there that Father Kenneth celebrated, I think it was 4 heart attacks in 1 week, and was laid up in the hospital, and some other pastors and I then took over the responsibility of preaching and celebrating Mass here while he was incapacitated. At that time it was touch and go. We didn't know whether he would live or die. But he very definitely continued living and continued serving Zion for quite some time. Now the connection, I think, with Redeemer also was personal, because liturgical pastors in the Missouri Synod were a rather lonely breed. Stories were spoken, were passed about them. I mentioned to someone at lunch that a very prominent member of Synod passed the story around that von Schenk was celebrating Mass for the Knights of Pythias. And, you know, stories were told about Kenneth Runge and about Berthold von Schenk and about Adolf Wismar and all of them, and their names were very much misused, and this kind of brought them together. And this also reflected itself in interest in education, because Father Kenneth was very much dedicated to Christian education as a mission tool of the church. And for many years, the resources of this parish were primarily dedicated to the establishment of a school. And really very much the same thing happened at Redeemer, especially in the latter days of Dr. Kurth's ministry and during Pastor Lindemann's time there. The realization of all of these men of the importance of Christian education and the role of the Eucharistic life.
Thank you, Father. I'd like to open it to questions from the floor. Okay, so the question is, in the last 30 years, there seems to have been a confessional and liturgical revival, and could we identify some of the key players? Yeah, both Father Eckert and Cantor Royning's papers are going to treat this subject, and it's one of the major themes of our conference today, so it's an outstanding question. But let me yield to Father Evanson to comment on that.
You won't have anything left to say?
Well, I think, no, I will just mention, I think it goes back further than 30 years. And I think it is identified with some of the men in our teaching institutions, like Gerhard Mundinger, who taught at Fort Wayne, and Arthur Karl Piepkorn in St. Louis, and others who had a great deal of influence on their students. And also, I noticed immediately when I joined the Missouri Synod, which was in 1956, that there was a much greater appreciation of the sacraments than I had ever found in the ULC, although I had been in a very conservative and theologically straight ULC congregation. There was a reverence and understanding of the sacraments among many Missourians that was unmatched anywhere else in American Lutheranism. And this, I think, came from old faithful pastors who said, this is what our confessions teach, this is what the Bible teaches, and this is the responsibility that we were given as pastors.
Thank you, Father. And one of the students of Father Peephorn is with us, Charles McLean. And Father McLean is going to join us for the panel to comment on liturgy and its state. Father Zeiler.
It's my last year at seminary. I did a study on LBW or LW, and there was a lot of similarities. And then I looked at the agenda to go with them, and I saw marked differences in approaching the one that I focused on, was ordination rites. The LBW was kind of a I don't know, write your own kind of thing, and the Missouri Synod one was based on the Western liturgical tradition. What really struck me is the question, the oath that you take not to divulge any of the sins that are confessed to you. Did that appear in any of our agenda prior to the Lutheran worship agenda, rite of ordination?
Thank you, Father Zeile. So the question deals with the agenda rights between the Green Dragon and our editing of the Green Dragon. And we'll let Father Evanson answer.
Very interesting. In 1981, the Synod Convention thanked us for Lutheran worship, and then from now on, they said, you're going to be a subcommittee of parish services, accepting that we've given you a responsibility, independent responsibility, to produce an agenda. And they didn't give us any specifications. So we were on our own. We could do as we pleased. And we could take our time. And so the head of parish services came to our first meeting, and we thanked him for coming and said, we'll let you know when we're done with our work. We never finished our work until the next convention, and at that time, we were again given independent status. The ordination service was frankly something that I was primarily responsible for. And I found that phrase in German agendas, but I did not find it in the Missouri Synod agenda. But it seemed to me that it was quite appropriate. And it was something that was very sorely needed. And we included it. We also included, though, as a Bible passage, 1 Timothy 6, in which the district president or the ordainer was to assure the congregation that he had examined this candidate and was not violating the apostolic word that you are not to lay hands suddenly on any man. That never got by the presidents. They were not willing to allow that one through. But we did get the not divulging of secrets through. And that makes me recall a very significant statement of Father Kenneth Runge. He said, what has killed private absolution in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is that the majority of our pastors are married. And they do not keep any secrets from their wives. So people will not confess to them because they know the pastor's wife will know about it by nightfall. And by tomorrow noon, everybody in the parish will know. You know? It's like the old Jewish saying, if I know it, that's one person. If I tell somebody else, that's 11.
Okay, so just to restate, what are the things that we would have done different in LW had we had the opportunity, and then what are the things that the church needs most today in that same vein? Father?
I cannot speak for the whole committee. I can speak for myself and maybe also give some insight into what Dr. Bixel thought. We were concerned, first of all, about music. Traditionally, the music that we have used in our services is not really up to the content of the service. And I recall when I was a student at Valparaiso, Bixel saying that it was obvious to him that whoever set matins and vespers to worship, to music in TLH was bound and determined to destroy the use of both services, because you had to turn the page 7 times to sing the Venite, and you had odd-numbered canticles with even-numbered chants, which meant you had to go halfway back. And also the format was so bad that after the canticle, pastors would say the prayers and then go on to say the Our Father and the Collect of the Day, because they thought that's what they were supposed to do. And we had others that just really didn't know what they were doing. And we would have tried to, I think, to clarify that. The other, in terms of what I see lacking, I see today a basic lack of any sense of the holy. I see pastors saying, you know, our Lord Jesus Christ, the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take, eat, this is my body. And just slinging this pattern around. And the same thing with the cup. It's unseemly. And these are people who call themselves liturgical. I think maybe we ought to make them go back and read Rudolf Otto's, Heiler's Das Heilige, which was the book that brought him into the Lutheran Church. We have lost our sense of reverence. We need again to learn with Moses that we are on holy ground and we need to take off our shoes.
Okay, so Weber and whom? Una Sancta. Yeah, actually, I think in this vein, we could mention Pro Ecclesia, the bride, Una Sancta, the magpie, and ultimately, as the fruition of all, Gottesdienst, and the role of liturgical press in liturgical renewal.
I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but I remember getting a letter from Sam von Schenk written on the stationery of Una Sancta, saying, well, now that Richard Newhouse has taken over Una Sancta, we'll have to use this for some useful purpose. Because one thing you have to say about Richard John is that whatever he does, it will be to the greater glory of Richard John. And I knew Richard John. I was ordained by his father. And but I have to say that Una Sancta then went off in a different direction. It was not the same magazine paper that I had known in the early 50s and the early 60s. The other magazines were just kind of occasional. They were well-intentioned. I don't think they got much play in the church. I wish they had gotten more, but maybe it's because we weren't really very well organized at that time. There was another part to the question I can't think of. What was it? Weber. Oh, Weber. Yes. He, of course, wrote a wonderful book. But in his latter days, he decided that he had been wrong. He said that he had been wrong in thinking that the Gothic age was the golden age of the church. And he became a close confidant and correspondent for Herman Otten. He lived up in Mount Vernon, New York, north of the Bronx, and kept feeding news on the Atlantic District to Herman. But we owe him a great debt of gratitude for his book. It's still very useful today.
Thank you, Father. So the question deals with the liturgy and unity in the church. And I'd like to recognize that some of the people that worked on LSB are with us and ask Father Evanson to respond to the question of the liturgy and unity. Thank you.
not a new question. Luther addresses himself to this question in 1530. He says, he noted that there has been a proliferation of services. The priests are writing their own services. He says, now, if you want a truly God-pleasing service, then I suggest that you stick with the Holy Mass, because this was given us by our Lord, and it has everything. It is a fitting memorial and gift from God to us. Now, we have made the mistake, we've bought into the idea that liturgy is meant to be a tool for the renewal of the church. It's not really meant to be that kind of a tool. In 1976, the Archbishop of Sweden was asked, what is the Church of Sweden doing to address godlessness in Sweden? He said, we've written a new liturgy. Well, of course, the godless in Sweden are never going to hear it or see it or take any part in it. See? The liturgy is meant for the family of God. And it's not primarily meant to be a mission tool. We should have mission services and we should have mission preaching. But you would never say to your family, today, instead of having our Thanksgiving dinner, we're going to have hot dogs because we don't want to offend people who don't like turkey, whatever, something like that. You don't starve your children because you don't want to insult the neighbors. I remember, though, a pastor in a large church here in Detroit who told me, well, we never celebrate communion at Easter because that would be offensive to all of the non-Lutherans that come to our Easter service. Good heavens. What does Luther say? Let us keep this Easter day with Christ, the bread of heaven. We don't do it because we don't want to offend anybody. This is a disservice to the people of God. But we don't see it that way because we have misunderstood what worship is for, what the Lord does with it, and what it's meant to be and what it isn't meant to be. And I think we need to get clear on that, and I think partly the responsibilities of our seminaries and our pastoral conferences to make that clear. Right now, pastoral conferences seem to be the worst offenders. Who knows what sort of circus they're going to come up with.
Now, so a question on the relationship between education and Christian piety in our children.
In the early 60s, I served as a Latin teacher in Lutheran High School in the Bronx, Our Savior Lutheran High School, and I found out what a Lutheran school can be. All the way from, my wife taught fourth grade, and they had sign of the cross practice. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. They learned what it means to be baptized. And there would be baptism anniversaries every month for all the kids baptized that month. Every Saint's Day, there was a Eucharist. So those who had been confirmed, or those who had been admitted to First Communion, which in that parish were those who had been in the school beginning in first grade, and in third grade had taken a First Communion class for 2 months or more with Dr. von Schenk, and then they were admitted to the sacrament on Laetare Sunday, the Sunday of the Bread of Life, and they knew what the sacrament was, and they came, and the high schoolers also, their school experience was built around daily worship, and it was not this kind of demonstrative things that always end up proclaiming law rather than gospel, but they were gospel services. And they sang matins, they sang hymns, they knew the hymnal. In their classrooms, they would begin with hymn 1 and go all the way through and learn them all. I found out what a school could be, and then I had 3 schools and found out that schools weren't all like that, and that some of your greatest opponents would be teachers, because the teachers had their idea what the school was supposed to be, and it had very little to do with worship. And this is we got to get our act together. We need to be clear, and also in the Christian home. the importance of the catechism. I was fortunate enough when I was being catechized, I had a pastor who the first session read to us Luther's preface. And I was only, in 7th grade? It left an astonishing impression on me. And so I try to read it at least once a week. You know? And you got the introduction, and you got 6 parts, so 7 days of the week you can go through the catechism. And and this is, I think, important in the school and in the home. One of the things that I decry is that we insist on doing what Luther said we should never do, and that is, he said, don't change the version. And we insist on doing that. And I came back after 16 years after, what's this, practice satanic arts. What the dickens is this? I remember back in the 60s when the Board for Parish Education wanted to eliminate practice witchcraft because that's old-fashioned, nobody does that anymore. Good heavens. Don't mess around with the translation. If you think you can do it better in your own mind. But let the people learn one thing. Then the whole congregation can say it together. And it's important to do that. Have the congregation. Now let's say Luther's explanation of the second article together. And this is something, those of you who knew Dr. Kenneth Corby would know something about the importance of that. He grew up in a congregation where when the congregation joined the Missouri Synod, they were catechized for 2 years. And the pastor said, next Sunday we will all say together the stanza, "My Savior, be thou near me when death is at my door." Everyone from the oldest member of the congregation to the youngest will say it. And this left a tremendous impression on him, and he became an educationist. This is very important. And that's where we fall down is that Sunday morning does not get the kind of support that it needs to get in school and at home.
So the question is a bibliography of liturgical resources.
If you want to put it in the form of a question.
No, that's
Jeopardy.
And before I pass off the mic, Redeemer Fort Wayne has on their website a bibliography of liturgical resources that would be very helpful. But let me let Father Evanson. Let me let Father Evanson answer.
I would mention a couple of books that have been particularly important to me. Well, first of all, Luther's 8 Little Wittenberg sermons, 1522, the Invocavit Week sermons. I think that every Lutheran pastor should every year in Invocavit Week read those sermons. This is what the Lutheran Reformation is all about. And I think they'd be very helpful to you in terms of pastoral ministry, in terms of homiletics, in terms of liturgy. Also, Luther's treatise that these words, "This is my body," stand firm against the fanatics, which makes very clear the sacramental difference between Lutheranism and the Reformed, which is paramount. It's very important. And of course, the Great Confession of 1528. Also, the private Mass and the consecration of priests of 1532. Also, there is a little book that was published by Fortress Press in 1960 by Bishop Olaf Herlin of the Diocese of Visby in Sweden, Liturgical Divine Service, Liturgy in Perspective, in which he talks about, for example, particularly the heart of the liturgy, and particularly the relationship between liturgy and social ministry. The role of the deacon. Why does the deacon read the gospel and lead the bids? Because he is the man in the congregation who is responsible for the treasury and for dealing with the poor. He knows who needs to be prayed for. And so that is his responsibility. We have lost sight of a lot of these things. That's a very, and there's many others. And I'm sure that Father Peterson has included the most important ones, and his website. But I also wanted to say one other thing, because someone brought this up at lunch. Something about von Schenk. Dr. von Schenk's closest friend through seminary was a man by the name of Elmer Felber. They were classmates in the seminary, and they married girls who had grown up together in St. Louis. Elmer took a call to South Dakota, and then from there he went to Fort Wayne, where he taught at the junior college, and from there he went to St. Louis to be senior editor at CPH. And in von Schenk's book, The Presence, he credits Elmer for having been willing to serve as the editor for that. After von Schenk died, Elmer retired and moved back to Fort Wayne because his daughter was a member of my parish, and he had once been the assistant pastor at Redeemer. And he said to me, he says, you know, I've been worried. I've been wondering, what about old Sam? Would he have left Synod? This was a year after the walkout. Would he have left? And I said, well, let me quote you something that he wrote in his memoirs. He was given a very, very difficult time by church officials in St. Louis and by the Presidium of the Atlantic District. He was really treated very shabbily. But he said, and also he was offered 4 parishes in the Episcopal Diocese of Albany, but turned him down. He said, I'll always be a Missourian. Here's to Missouri, the old bitch. Only a bitch can give birth to a champion.
Okay, thank you, Bishop Steckles. The question was on the recovery of biblical terminology regarding the church and her offices.
First of all, Bishop, I want to thank you for this certificate, because I can use this now to prove to people that I was not ordained before the flood. I would have to say that I don't think the prospects are too good. Because frankly, from what I have been able to see, and I've spent an awful lot of time at what Fred Brecht used to call the head shed in St. Louis, and I don't see a lot of district presidents or synodic officials having any interest in being anything more than ecclesiastical businessmen. They don't see themselves as bishops. They don't act like bishops. They all have desks, but they don't have altars. When I was ordained, there was one district president who was not serving a congregation, old Papa Gresser. And he was the English district, or rather the Atlantic district president, and he was sick. So he had retired from his parish in Providence, Rhode Island. He was the only one that was not serving a parish. And at that time, Frederick Heiler, in his German periodical Eine Heilige Kirche, quoted Dom Gregory Dix as saying that the Lutheran Church had, at that time, a polity which most closely approximated the early church. It had bishops who were active priests serving parishes, visiting the sick, preaching, and so on. Now, the same cannot be said today. And any district president who says, I want to serve a parish is going to get nothing but static and flack from his board of directors and others in the district. And consequently, you get a burgeoning hierarchy and bureaucracy. I'll give you the example of churches in the Baltic. My heart is with the Lithuanian church, which has only 54 parishes, 24 priests, at least 25% of whom were formerly Roman Catholic priests. People ask us, do you ever lose any pastors to the Roman Church? I say, no, not in the whole history of the church. but they lose a lot of priests to us. And one of them told me that, talking to his friends who are still in the Roman Church, he said, if Lutheran pastors in Lithuania got a salary, you'd have a line out the door. Because Lutheran pastors are not paid. They have to make a living as best they can, usually with their wives working. Anyway, the bishop also has a parish. The pastor who has the largest congregation, his name is Mindaugas Tikšaitis, pastor in Tarauga. He's got at least 5,000 congregations, 5,000 parishioners in that one congregation, and he's also serving 5 other congregations. They give their life to the ministry, and the bishop is busy. He does have an assistant, but he's busy all the time doing his pastoral work. You go next door to Latvia, and they have 3 bishops and a burgeoning bureaucracy. You can't get anything done because you've got to pass it through so many different committees. We invited, we had doxology come last year, and I put one man in charge in Lithuania, Dr. Darius Pitkunas. He did the whole thing. He took care of housing, he took care of meals, he took care of the speakers, getting them to and from the airport, and everything else. Then we also ran the program in Latvia. They established a 5-man commission, which could do nothing but call Pitkunas and ask him what to do. But that's what's happening in our church. And this, we've got to fight this. We are ordained to the ministry, or we're not ordained to sit behind a desk. The congregation that called me once, or was considering calling me, they rescinded that idea very quickly. I told them I didn't need a desk, I needed an altar. If I need to meet with parishioners, we can sit in the church before God's altar and talk. But I wasn't called to sit behind a desk. I think that we need to get back to the work of the ministry, and then we will get back to the point where men will know what it is to be a bishop, to be a shepherd of souls. And then these things will come more naturally.
Father Peterson.
You said when you came to Redeemer they had Congo lines, and now it doesn't. Do you have any advice for how to move a congregation, for how to deal with a congregation that has bad practice?
Do you want to see the scars? Well, this is one of these situations where you can't say, well, what do you folks want to do? You've got to say, this is not who we are, this is not what we do. And just stop it. Just don't give them the opportunity to it. We had an assistant pastor say, let's have communion. So they'll run up to the chapel and have communion. Now let's all go dancing. You can't have that stuff. And those who want that way, and there's a lot of them, they will leave. Because you can't save them. There's nothing you can do. We had an assistant pastor who ran into some moral problems, and a number of his friends left the parish. They were upset. They were basically upset that he didn't get away with it. There's not much you can do about that. You cry over it and you pray over them, but you've got to maintain who you are. I recall the story of a man who took his son to an ordination service, and the little boy kept asking questions. What are they doing now? What are they doing now? And finally, the man who was being ordained was kneeling before the altar, and the bishop and other ministers had their hands on his head, and the little boy says, what are they doing now? And he said, now they are removing his backbone.